So, guys, as we've been reporting, there have been active negotiations for another ceasefire agreement, a temporary or even a potentially permanent ceasefire. Hamas returned their counter proposal, and Bibi Netanyahu has rejected it completely out of hand. Let's take a listen to some of his comments.
I came here this evening to say we are on our way to that decisive victory. It is in our hands. It's not a matter of perhaps weeks, but it is in a matter of months. The IDF are working systematically, and they will achieve all the objectives of the war. They're going to release all the hostages, eliminate Hamas, and Gaza will no longer be a threat to Israel. The achievements of the IDF are unprecedented. Within 4 months, the IDF have wounded and killed over 20,000 terrorists. In other words, we're talking about all those brigades that we have actually achieved to eliminate.
There is, first of all, no evidence that they have killed 20,000 fighters, and even independent analysts, even a former general from the U.S. said that their success has been incredibly limited. They have not taken out the top Hamas leadership. They've not destroyed the tunnel system. So he's, really trying to convince the Israeli people that victory is just around the corner, just months away, just at hand, and they're going to get the hostages released, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's fine to reject this deal. Of course, the reality is that they've killed more of their own hostages by quite a number at this point than they've been able to rescue through military operations. The only time hostage releases were secured was during the last temporary ceasefire. So I want to give you a sense of what the Hamas counterproposal was because, the media doesn't cover it in depth, and also because the U.S. is saying it contains non-starters, quote-unquote non-starters. One of those non-starters is that they actually want the war to end, and the U.S. and Israel do not want the war to end. Let's go ahead and put this up on the screen. The basic idea here, I'm not going to read all of this, guys, but I'll give you the top line. The basic idea here is for a 3-stage deal with different groups being released in each of those stages. In the first stage, they say they would see a temporary cessation of military operations, and the two parties will release Israeli detainees from among women and children under the age of 19, not conscripted, the elderly, the sick, in exchange for a number of Palestinian prisoners, ensuring the release of all individuals whose names are pre-agreed upon during this stage. Also critical here, they say they want to start reconstruction of hospitals across the Strip. And that last bullet, this part is also really important, beginning of indirect negotiations regarding the requirements necessary for restoring complete calm. So effectively in the first stage, you'd start some reconstruction, you'd have a total pullout of the Israeli military, you'd have this first batch of hostages released and Palestinian prisoners exchanged, and you would start negotiations to a complete end of the conflict. That's the part that really is the non-starter, quote unquote, for the Israelis in the US.
Right.
Let's put the next piece up on the screen here regarding second stage. It would be another 45 days. This stage aims to release all detained men, civilians, and conscripts in exchange for specific numbers of Palestinian prisoners, continuation of humanitarian measures. So the basic idea here is you sort of continue the projects of reconstruction and the continued negotiations while men and IDF soldiers are released in exchange for Palestinian prisoners. Put the next piece up on the screen. In the third stage, you'd have a complete cessation of military operations from both sides, redeployment of Israeli forces away from populated areas. Both parties will release all Israeli detainees from among women and children under the age of 19, not conscripted, elderly, sick, in exchange for all prisoners in the occupation's prisons, including women, children, elderly. Let's put the last piece up on the screen. This is also the stage where any hostage dead bodies, because there's somewhere around 50 hostages who have been killed at this point, unsurprising given that they're in the Gaza Strip under heavy bombardment at this point. There's some other pieces here, like stopping the incursions and aggression by Israeli settlers on Al-Aqsa Mosque, returning the situation at Al-Aqsa Mosque to what it was before 2002. That may not sound like a big deal. That is considered kind of a big ask.
Yeah.
Return of displaced persons, ensuring opening of all crossings, lifting any Israeli restrictions on the movement of travelers, patients, and the wounded through that Rafah crossing, resupplying the Gaza Strip, and the occupation's commitment to supplying Gaza with its electricity and water needs. So that was a lot, guys. But basically the idea from the Hamas proposal was these 3 stages, different types of hostages released in each stage, with the idea that the negotiations would be ongoing to bring about a complete end of the conflict. And Saagar, that's the piece that's really considered a non-starter. We can also get Tony Blinken responded to these negotiations. He's claiming the negotiations aren't dead. I don't know whether that's true or not. You can't really believe a word that comes out from any of these people's mouths, by the way. But let's take a listen to his response to the Hamas proposal.
We've looked very carefully at what came back from Hamas, and there are clearly non-starters in what it's put forward. But we also see space in what came back to pursue negotiations to see if we can get to an agreement. With regard to Rafah, look, as I said before, Israel has the responsibility, has the obligation to do everything possible to ensure that civilians are protected and that they get the assistance they need in the course of this conflict. Any military campaign, military operation that Israel undertakes needs to put civilians first and foremost in mind. And I suggested, again, some ways to do that. And that's especially true in the case of Rafah, where there are somewhere between 1.2 and 1.4 million people, many of them displaced from other parts of Gaza. So we want to make sure, again, that in anything that's done, in any military operations, the situation for civilians is first and foremost in mind, and that the necessary steps are taken to make sure that they're protected and they have the assistance they need.
So a few things there. I mean, first of all, again, he describes the Hamas proposal as a non-starter, and largely because you can read into that, they want the war to end. And I'm going to show you some polling in just a minute that shows you exactly why Bibi Netanyahu does not want the war to end, which is because Israeli citizens overwhelmingly want his ass out of there once the war does end. So that's always been his posture. The other piece that's really important there, though, is where he's talking about Rafah. And the reason that's so significant is because as Palestinians were forced out of Gaza City, they were forced down to Khan Yunis, then they were forced down to Rafah. Now you have over 1 million people clustered at the border, and Israel signaling that they are planning to widen their operation to that Rafah border. Well, you can only imagine. I mean, it's already a total humanitarian catastrophe there. You can only imagine if you start having scenes of battle and intense bombing and all of that on top of this incredibly densely packed civilian population clustered now in Rafah, what kind of a catastrophe that would be. I mean, even given the levels of destruction and chaos and atrocities that we've seen, it could be the case that we haven't seen anything yet compared to what could unfold in Rafah.
That's actually where, obviously, that's also why Blinken is so concerned, at least privately. Let's put this up there on the screen.
Words.
He's got it up here. Tony Blinken was actually told directly, this is from Axios yesterday, by the defense minister that if they do have a rejection of the ceasefire, that the operation into Gaza, quote, will expand in the city that have now mostly remained unharmed. Blinken told Blinken during this meeting that this will push them into continuation of the ground operation, and that the response, they said, was drafted in a way that they believe that Israel will reject it. The Hamas position will just lead to the continuation of the war and our forces to enter more places in Gaza soon. So it's pretty
the Israelis
clear.
never have any responsibility for their actions.
The clear point that they're making there is that they're like, this is going to continue. And part of the reason why that this could actually be the most explosive is like, look, we've already had, what, tens of thousands of civilians who have been killed, 2 to 1, maybe 3 to 1 in ratio. Nobody even really knows what it is. But because the civilian population is so densely populated here, it is actually conceivable that if airstrikes and ground operations were to be continued, especially if they were going to operate the same way they did in Khan Yunis and Gaza, no reason to think they're not, that the civilian population, or the civilian death toll would actually be even higher. There's also way more tunnel mileage under the Rafah crossing than there is anywhere else in the rest of the Gaza Strip, which means that it will be deadlier for the IDF, and then more likely that they would have to use, or will use, bombs that will try to collapse them. I'm interested. So there's a piece of news that just flashed, and I wanted to know what your take was here. They say Israel will allow the exile, actually, of Yahya Sinwar from Gaza in exchange for the release of all the remaining 136 hostages. NBC is reporting now, citing 6 Israeli officials and senior advisors. Do you think that could be a way out of this? Oh, go ahead.
I mean, they're just my understanding of the proposal, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, because I just saw the headline as well. But is that basically they're like, oh, we'll let you live if you, basically like give up. And I can't imagine that he would agree to those sort of terms. So no, I don't see it as likely to, lead to any sort of path forward.
Yeah, I mean, that was just the only, well, I guess it's one of those counters where they want the release of all in exchange for one, and that would be exile. And then, it's not like it would actually give anything up. And he likely would be killed anyway, after he left. So, yeah, I mean, it doesn't seem like there's going to be any sort of negotiation. The real thing is that the reason why I think that this is just all kind of just arguing over rhetoric is, do the Israelis really believe that you're going to have a 2-month ceasefire and a resumption of military operations? I can't think of a single time in the past of modern conflict where you have 60 whole days of no fire and you have then a resumption of military hostilities. It just doesn't, and especially even more ramped up. Hamas, I mean, listen, they took those hostages for a reason. They know it's an emotional issue. Number one, they're not going to give up all their leverage, if it doesn't mean to a complete end to this. I am not justifying this. I think they should all be released. I'm just saying, from a pure, cold calculation perspective, they know this is the one chance that they have, basically from total annihilation. If they haven't even, if whatever they faced, it could be a lot worse if they didn't have hostages who are within them because of the Israeli populace, which, as you said, polling indicates how important that issue is to the Israelis themselves.
Yeah, there was a poll that just came out of Israeli society that asked them, hey, what do you think the goals of the military operation should be? What should take precedence? And a majority actually put, 51%, put bringing home the hostages over destroying Hamas. Only 36% said destroying Hamas. And I mean, of course, neither goal has been accomplished. Neither has been the real goal of the Netanyahu government, as we've, discussed at length. They've been incredibly ineffective at actually eradicating Hamas. They've only been effective at complete destruction of civilian infrastructure and massive civilian death tolls. That's what they have been very effective at doing. Even the tunnel system has not been remotely destroyed. So, and of course, as I said before, a lot of hostage families from the beginning, they have been saying, hey, we would take a deal that's all hostages released for all Palestinian prisoners released, what they call all for all. So while the U.S. government and the Netanyahu government are saying the Hamas deal is a non-starter, please understand that many Israelis, even, who don't have to be peaceniks, but even, families of the hostages, they would be very open to a deal like this if it meant that their family members, that all 136 of the hostages, those who remain alive, because a number of them, somewhere around, estimates are around 50, have been killed during this conflict. But some sort of deal of what Hamas has offered here that would bring all of the hostages home, they would be very open to. But again, the domestic political calculus for Bibi is he's got to keep the war going, because if he doesn't, then his political reign is going to be at an end. So please understand, when they say it's a non-starter, that's what they consider to be a non-starter, the idea that the war would actually end. We have another thing I can put up on the screen. I mean, to me, this is just more theater, but put this up on the screen. Netanyahu reacting to President Biden's little piddly sanctions on 4 settlers. He called them inappropriate and highly problematic. Is he really upset about this? I don't know, probably, I guess. But also, I think it benefits him for his right-wing base to act like he's outraged. It benefits actually President Biden for the Israelis to act outraged, because it makes this piddly, sort of pathetic virtue signaling action that they took, it makes it appear more meaningful than it actually was. So anyway, that's his reaction, as they were quote unquote inappropriate and highly problematic. Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.